So the last time I was in Denver was in 2017 for a conference called Changing Lands and Changing Hands. Maybe some of you were there. It was in June, not November, so it was not snowing. And coming back this time, I was thinking back to that trip, and one of the memorable moments for me was that I had the opportunity to meet Mrs. Shirley Sherrod at that conference. Some of you may know who that is. And her life story and experience and her leadership are really an inspiration for the work that I do today. So I wanted to share just a quick snippet about her before I start. So Shirley Sherrod is a civil rights activist and co-founder of an organization that was called New Communities, Inc. It was in 1969 that Shirley and Charles Sherrod, along with a number of other people, co-founded New Communities in Albany, Georgia, which was the country's first modern community land trust, and at the time was also one of the largest black land holdings in the country. They had purchased 5,700 acres in Georgia and had a vision for community self-determination that was grounded in an agricultural practice. And today there are over 200 community land trusts around the country that either knowingly or unknowingly have benefited from the example that was set by New Communities. Unfortunately, in 1985, New Communities folded. Their land was, they were forced to sell their land as a result of threats from neighboring landowners, and also after several years of drought, needing USDA support. And the governor of Georgia at the time, Lester Maddox, blocked that funding from coming in to support New Communities. And as a result, they had to sell all their lands. Later, and this might be the more recent way of knowing who Mrs. Sherrod was, but became state director of the USDA in Georgia and was fired by Tom Vilsack in 2010 for allegedly making racist remarks earlier in her career during her work in the USDA about support or lack of support that she was offering a white farmer in Georgia. It was based on an excerpted video that Breitbart News had posted on their blog and then had run through mainstream news outlets, and it was almost an overnight decision to have her fired. And since there's been apologies made, but it's a lesson that I keep and hold about avoiding knee-jerk responses, especially in an age of kind of digital information, and really taking time to listen before making judgments. And the story of New Communities as a whole, the possibility of what could have been if they had kept their land, is kind of a reminder for me of what we can achieve, and also of the harsh realities of how both interpersonal and structural racism and white supremacy pose ongoing challenges to achieving racial justice in our food system and in the United States. So anyways, I'm glad that I was able to share that little bit of a story with you. Again, my name's Neil. I'm co-director of an organization called Minnow, which the website is up, and we're based in California, and our purpose is to secure farmland tenure for farmers of color and indigenous communities in California. I'm also a lawyer, so we can just get that out of the way. And for the last several years, I've been working to try to find my place in not only fighting the existing system that Sarah sort of like laid out very well, which is what a lot of people think lawyers tend to do, but also support the development of the food system that is based on the values and assumptions that I've heard shared here and are separate and apart from what keep up the status quo. So along the way, I've worked on protecting the rights for people to freely share seeds, support the development of worker-owned farms, and learn and develop models of collective land ownership inspired by examples like New Communities and indigenous practices of land ownership, both here on Turtle Island and also in other places around the world. So here's my disclaimer. In the next few minutes, I want to share some things that are going to reinforce what I think we've all heard over the last couple of days. I might say some things, I might have already said some things, that provoke a kind of immediate response. And hopefully it's a good response, but it might be something else too. And just if you notice feeling that in your body, I just want to say that's the little capitalist inside of you. And it's been socialized into each and every one of us. I have it too. And he's sensitive. He doesn't really, he has a hard time hearing things sometimes that disconnect from how he views the world. And that's okay, he's welcome here. But I just want to invite all of us to recognize that we can hold a lot more complexity than what he wants us to do. And I just want to encourage us to keep doing that, because I think I've seen it already. So can we agree to try to do that? Okay, thank you. So why does land ownership matter? Why am I talking about our inner capitalist, and why do we explicitly focus on working with Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color? To me, who owns land determines how that land is stewarded. And at the individual scale, that matters because of its impact on the soil, of its impact on water, human and non-human beings in the immediate surroundings. But when we zoom out and think about who owns land across the country, then the answer to that question actually has impacts about how we organize society as a whole. And today, as also, I'm so glad that you had beautiful slides, because I have like my handouts. Land ownership is extremely consolidated in the hands of a small group of people. 98% of farmland is owned by white people, even though 60% of the people who actually work the land are not. And just consider that statistic for a moment, and how in the last 250 years, which is a relatively short span of time, we've arrived at that reality. And I just want to second the homework that Beth gave for all of us to find out in our own communities what happened to make that reality the case. And for me, there's an irreconcilable contradiction between capitalism, which is an extraction-based economy, and what the theme of this year's conference is, which is cultivating restorative economies. I also studied economics before going to law school, so my journey has also it's been interesting to sort of realize that the foundations of both of these bodies of knowledge, economics and law, have a lot shakier foundations than I first thought. And the reason I say this is because capitalist market-based economies always tend toward monopolies. We saw the bar graphs of how the top 4 companies control vast majorities of many sectors of our food system, where it's so apparent. And many of you have probably butt up against that and had direct experience with having to navigate systems that are highly consolidated, which is antithetical. Monopolies are antithetical to an economy of care, an economy based in reciprocity, and an economy that's racially equitable. And I encourage, we heard so much great information from Phil Warsaw these last couple of days. There's another Phil at Michigan State University, Phil Howard, who's done a lot of work on concentration in the food system. And I encourage all of us to follow his work. And I think he put out a book a couple of years ago about it as well. So not only does capitalism consolidate money and power in the hands of the few, it also has racialized impacts that consolidate those externalities that Sarah was talking about in non-white communities. Farm workers who are disproportionately Latinx and Indigenous have a shorter life expectancy than non-farm workers. Black, Native, and Latinx communities have 50 to 100% higher burden of illness and mortality from diabetes than white communities. Black and Native communities, especially in poorer neighborhoods, don't even have grocery stores to buy food. So the same consolidation that consolidates money and power on one side also concentrates the impacts, the negative impacts, and it's along racial lines in the US. And the same logic applies to land. Once land was commodified through colonization, it's been on this trajectory towards consolidation and monopoly ownership ever since. Every ag census that comes out, what do we see? We see that farms are getting bigger and that we have fewer of them. Right now, 8% of farms control 41% of all farmland, with the vast majority of ownership really resting at the largest scale of those farms. And does anybody know who the largest private landowner of farmland is in the US? Shout it out. That famous farmer, Bill Gates. Bill Gates owns 242,000 acres across 19 states. And just to paint that picture a little bit larger, it's not just about Bill Gates. The top 100 landowners own 40 million acres of land. That's 2/3 the size of Colorado. And the impacts of the consolidation and resulting land loss have disproportionately impacted Native and Black landholders, and to a lesser degree, other non-white, non-male landowners. So for me, if you want to see racial justice in the food system, then you have to be thinking about land justice. And there's two foundational pillars of the capitalist land economy that, to me, stand as barriers between where we are and where we need to go. And that's the work that drives us at Minnow. One is the legal fiction of private land ownership. And then the second is the economic fiction of land as a financial commodity. And both of these pillars have to be demolished. The reason that I say they're fictions is to emphasize that they're not based in any natural law, or they're not written into stone anywhere. These are concepts and rules that have been written down, mostly by white men, but that doesn't make them immovable. And I want us to all think and be empowered to realize that what people have created, people can change. And that's what our calling is. As long as we hold on a pedestal the notion of private land ownership and land as a commodity, and that it can and should be sold for the highest profit, then the current trajectory of consolidation of land will continue. So how do we destroy these foundational pillars? With the time that I have right now, I would love to be able to get into the technical changes and the work that we're doing at Minnow, but I think what I want to share with you all is that it's really the values and relationships that we build that are going to determine whether or not we're going to successfully implement those technical changes and practices. And so what I'm going to share are just a few of those values and principles that we can all consider going forward. First is advancing indigenous sovereignty. Returning land into indigenous hands is a key part of the solution and has been a call for generations. We call it land back and right now, but that continues to be something that inspires our work and is something that we are committed to be in solidarity with going forward. The other is democracy as a daily practice. Community ownership of land is something that we work on in democratic governance, and those are critical components to sharing decision-making authority over how to care for the land in the ways that meet the needs of whole communities and not just individual owners. It's not a muscle that we get to exercise all that much. I know we have an election coming up, but we have to be willing and be able and have opportunities to practice democracy more than just every 4 years with our vote. It needs to be woven into the daily practice of all of our lives. Decommodifying land, ending financial speculation on land is a necessary component of creating a restorative land economy. Mariella shared yesterday that land's not a commodity, and so many of you know that just from your work as land stewards. You recognize that land is a living being and one with whom our relationship can't be centered on extraction and personal financial benefit. That is going to be a difficult conversation that all of us need to have with our inner capitalist. And the last is reflection and solidarity. And all of us have unlearning and reflection to do when it comes to the legacy and the ongoing impacts of systems of oppression, colonialism, racism, white supremacy. And I want to underscore again something that Beth shared, that white landowners in particular, given the racial makeup of who owns land in this country, have your work cut out for you in reflecting on this history and understanding the social responsibility that comes with that land ownership in an effort to move forward towards restoration and repair. So if anything that I shared, I'm going to just conclude now, sparked curiosity about exploring what values we have and what relationships we might need to build in order to reimagine the future of land, then I welcome the opportunity to build that relationship with you. Thank you. answering questions.
Sure,
Okay.
we sure will. All right, question time. Anyone have questions? See one?
Hi, my name's Zach. I'm from New Mexico. My farm is on what used to be a commons. It was granted by the Spanish government. It's a little colonial in itself, but we're facing a lot of challenges. We're running out of water. The remnant of the land grant is proposed to be developed for like this 30,000 or 8,000 home, 2 golf course mega development. It's like really crazy. I mean, capitalism on the one hand is driving all this, and I look across the fence and I say that's evil, that should be a commons. And then I also live on a piece of stolen land, and I'm a white man. I'd like to ask a couple questions, like what are the specific sort of alternative approaches to land ownership, like commons, like what are the nuts and bolts, if you could say a little bit about that, and then what, as somebody who is a white landowner, can we do to be allies?
Thanks for sharing that and asking the question. So when we were starting Minnow, I think a lot of people we talked to were like, oh, so you're starting a land trust. And we had to say, no, that's not what we're doing. So that's not, we're not a land trust. We're not in the business of buying and owning land ourselves. But has been a useful tool and can continue to be a useful tool, one of many different options available to structure land ownership that prioritizes community governance, for example. And community land trusts in particular, as opposed to more traditional conservation agricultural land trusts, really prioritize that governance over from people who have a connection to the land itself. The legal models for how to structure land ownership that prioritizes some of the principles that I talked about aren't necessarily limited to nonprofits or LLCs, or you can structure democratic governance in many different kinds of legal entities. So I'm answering and not answering your question in terms of the specifics, because it is every land transaction is its own unique snowflake, right? It's its own situation that calls for different tools to be brought to the table. Depending on what kind of financing exists, that's going to impact what structure you choose to organize and own land. So that's the best answer that I can give you without being able to talk directly about a particular situation. But just to say that there are, and part of our work is to create examples of different kinds of land ownership so that we have more things to look to answer the question when it comes up, because the question comes up all the time. How do you structure community land ownership? And right now we have a community land trust as a good, solid kind of model, not perfect, but we're exploring other tools that are at our disposal. To the second question, I think it's a good question. I should have expected it. I think curiosity, cultivating humility, valuing, listening, and relationship building are all maybe guiding principles to being in community with the people that you want to be in community with. And I would highlight of those three, listening as the first step. And then once you build those relationships, take your cues from the people who you're in community with.
The foundation of wealth, I guess around the world, is land. And so that's how you are a wealthy person or a rich person, maybe not wealthy, but rich. And culturally, in my nation, the land went through the women's side of the family. So women were rich. With this reimagining a new form of wealth that this gentleman spoke about this morning from Egypt, this love that I also can resonate with, not being a lawyer and not being what you are, how can we begin to imagine a new kind of wealth not based on land, to give you credit, credibility, and financial access?
That's a good question. I appreciate the question. I don't know that I have any particular answer, and I will definitely say that I don't think me being a lawyer means that I have any closer relationship to the answer than anybody else. I think what I have is a closer view of what the current sort of system is, which can give ideas for how to cultivate something different, but in and of itself does not open the door to the culture that we want to create, where land is not the sole basis of the financial wealth that is then necessary in order to have a good livelihood. But I don't have many things that I don't have the answers to. One among them is, for example, I talk with Mariela about this all the time, like if we remove land from the marketplace and decommodify it, if land is still, and if the rest of the system stays as is, then are we just impoverishing ourselves further by not taking advantage of the ability to speculate and to build financial wealth off the land? I don't have the answer to that question, but what it tells me is that what I'm doing is not the whole part of the solution, it's only one part of it, and I need to be, and I think we need to be in relationship with people who are addressing other parts of the systems that exist that may not have anything to do with food and agriculture, but have to do with reimagining our economy and how what we consider wealth and what we consider of value that goes well beyond, what the piece of it that I happen to be working on.
Thank you. And
Do we have time for?
we'll do one more question. I have it right here. And also, Neil, if you want to end this question with any closing remarks as well.
I was just wondering if you have any examples worldwide of what you're talking about, if you have any examples of where it's being done, anywhere else in the world, and what their challenges and their successes are.
Where in the U.S. are you based?
Northern Wyoming.
Northern Wyoming, okay. Don't know examples in Northern Wyoming off the top of my head, but it's happening.
It's a little town of 50 people called Hyattville.
Cool.
We're 45 miles from the nearest grocery store.
Okay, all right.
We're 45 miles from the nearest gas station.
Gotcha. Thanks for sharing. I will say that so one project that we're working on, I'll just share some of the work that I'm most directly connected to as one example, but I imagine people in this room will have other examples that I don't know about. But suffice to say that it is happening across the country and in other parts of the world as well. And it takes different names in different parts of the world. I was having a conversation with Phil earlier this morning. We were talking about the concept of land reform, which is a different version of, I think, the work that we're doing at a smaller scale, that happens at the larger governmental scale. And I think we have a particular view of what land reform means, and it's particularly negative in the US context, especially when we talk about land reform that happens in other parts of the world, which is not perfect, but it is something that we can, I think, learn from. And it's happened in many places in Latin America, and in other parts of the world as well. But a project that I'm working on in Mendocino County in California is to facilitate the transfer of land from the state of California, and so in this case, it's a public landholder, to 3 tribal governments. And this is a result of many years of work by the tribes and by the archaeologists at Caltrans who discovered cultural resources on that site and was obliged by law to make contact with the tribes whose are the most likely descendants of that area, and that sparked a conversation about what should be done about the property. Fast forward many years to 2019, 2020, the governor of California issued an official apology on behalf of the state of California to indigenous peoples of the state and directed state agencies to inventory excess lands to be either co-managed or transferred to local indigenous communities. And so this is part of that process. And so we're working with the tribes who have had to form a separate organization and interface with the state of California to facilitate this transfer of land. They're not selling it to the tribes, they're handing it back to the tribes, which is not free, by the way, but they're handing it back for it to be governed and stewarded by an indigenous-led nonprofit. That's just one example that we happen to be working on at Minnow. There are many other similar land return projects, whether it's from private landowners or public landowners, that either have taken place or are taking place in California and in many other, in Nebraska, many places that you all are probably from. So those are some examples, and I think seeking them out, if you're curious, you'll definitely be able to find them, and I can share more resources separately. Did you have another question? I forgot if you had another question. Challenges. Let's talk about that another time. This is too long to talk about right now. Yeah.
You will be at a roundtable?
Unfortunately, I won't, but I will be available via email after the conference because I need to get on a plane right now.
Great, okay. There was a question in our virtual chat about how to get a hold of you. I think that your email is in the program.
It is.
Great.
Yep.
So if you'd like to chat more with Neil, email you?
Yes.
Okay,
Happy to.
fantastic, thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Let's give it up for Neil.